Welcome to the Velero community meeting for 20th of August, 2024. Let's go ahead and get started. So the general status I've just copied from last meeting. Daniel, let me know if any of this has changed. But 114.1 tentative release is for the 26th of August, so that's next week. Looks like we're still on track from what I'm seeing in the PRs and everything.
Yeah.
And feature complete for 115 is also next week. So again, if there's any issues, people have concerns.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that. We discussed with the other teammates internally in Beijing because at this moment we are as part of post the acquisition, we are in the process of like data center migration and some infra convergence stuff, and also Wenkai is out in QCon Hong Kong this week. So I wish to propose we delay the FC date for 1 or 2 weeks. Do you have any concerns?
I think on our side, I don't think there's any problems. Wes, is there anything that strikes you as an issue with that? We're talking about when? Are we talking about 114.1 or about one? So the feature complete or
1.15. 1.15 feature
Oh,
complete.
sorry. So we're talking about
1.14
feature complete. Yeah. I don't see any issues with that on my side. Again, Wes or anyone else in Red Hat.
Yeah, 115 is fine. Any changes to the 114.1 dates though would be my more pressing
That's
concern.
on track.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're good then. And that's actually good for me because I was sick last week, and so I didn't make as much progress on. No progress on my stuff last week anyway. So I'm back now. So 1 week delay is kind of consistent with where I am for my feature at least.
Yeah, take your time.
Okay. And if anyone has any specific issues to talk about here, that's fine. If not, we can move on. Again, with the extra week or two, maybe less pressing today. But again, if there's any feature that you're assigned to or that you see that you're concerned about, we should bring it up if we don't think it's going to make it. But okay. Yeah, so my status, again, I was sick last week, so not much updates. I did see when I was back yesterday, my second PR got merged, so that's great. My next task this morning is going to be to rebase this PR now. Now that so it'll only have the one commit because the other one is now on main, and then I'm going to resume kind of trying to test this in a real environment. But once I've updated this and there's only one commit, feel free to start reviewing. I'll probably wait to move from draft until I've done at least some preliminary testing in a real cluster rather than just unit tests, but expect that to happen over the next few days. Okay, Shubham.
Yeah, I worked on the backup PVC configuration feature last week. I think implementation PR is merged, and I just have the docs PR up, maybe ready for review. Okay, I got some access yesterday. Yeah, I'll merge this today. And other than this, I've been doing some PR reviews of 115 features. That's it from my side.
Okay. Mikhail?
There is one PR up. I did review this with Scott offline using our own branch a bit. So this is being proposed upstream, a fix for an error which we are seeing in our testing. This is around managed fields giving some random errors in the logs because the objects were patched improperly and some race condition happened. So that's for review, ready for review.
Yeah, and just to add a little note, because I looked at this again with Miguel, kind of to kind of diagnose the problem. And basically, what happens with Velero is we create the object, and then there's a few lines of code. Some steps happen, and then we have the modify step because the managed fields can't be done in the create. And so, anytime you're working with Kubernetes resources that you've pulled, and then you do something, and then you try to update, there's always a chance the cluster's modified that in some way in the meantime. So this is just implementing the retries using the standard controller runtime libraries to do that. So I think this should be pretty straightforward. But
Yes, and here I use the function which is actually provided by the Kubernetes that allows to retry on this particular
right.
error.
Yeah, these are all standard. I think it's through controller runtime resources for this. But yeah, great to get this reviewed. And we've tested it on the IDP side. It's resolving issues where we run into them.
Yeah. So maybe one question: once this is approved, hopefully, and matched to main, do we want to backport this to some other branch, or main is just good enough for this?
It's a bug fix. I'd say it's certainly appropriate for the 114 branch. Obviously, it won't make 114.1 because that's coming out this week. But assuming there's a 114.2 at some point, that makes sense. 113
Okay.
might make sense. That's not a big concern on the Red Hat side because we're not using 113. But that's a question we can have once this is merged, I guess, as to how far back to backport. I'd say at least 114 makes sense. Beyond that, I don't really have an opinion.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, got it. And Tiger, we got a couple.
Right, yeah, so I have the 2 PRs ready for review. And yeah, please review if you have time. And that's it for me.
Status retry, and this is the make local issue. Okay. Discussion topics. I just had one. I noted that one of the changes that we're putting in the 114.1 is upgrading Golang from 122.2 to 122.6. Looks like that's CVE related. Couldn't tell from the PR if there are specific CVEs we were concerned about. I'm just wondering exactly what version has those fixes. Not a concern for 114.1. 122.6 is fine. It's kind of a downstream question. Specifically, I'm wondering whether 122.5 has all the fixes we care about, just because at the moment that's what we have available in our downstream system at Red Hat. 122.6 will get there eventually.
Okay.
I looked at the Golang change logs. It looks like 122.4 and 5 had security fixes, and 6 is just bug fixes. I'm just wondering if you know which version we need at a minimum here.
I don't have a quick answer right now. That one was not on my radar, but I can check with Shun tomorrow and get
Yeah,
back
that'd be great.
to you.
Yeah, just let me know if 122.5 is sufficient from a CVE point of view. Is my
Okay.
concern. Again, not a concern for upstream. The way we have it is great.
Okay.
It's just that the question is downstream. Can we use 122.5 for the moment? We'll eventually go to 122.6. It's just that as of today, we don't have that downstream.
Mhm.
Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah, just working on a small issue to get some nicer network transfer rate stuff out of Data Mover. So Daniel, thanks for looking at that. I think I see what you're saying about having redundant information in there. But before I get too far into it, so I was kind of had a feasibility question. I was wondering if anybody knows about Copia. Is there a way to get the amount of bytes it's actually moving over the network? I think right now we're including the stuff that it's skipping for like incremental or deep duplication or whatever it calls it. I don't know if there's a way to do that, if anybody knows.
Yeah, and so one thing I was
But
thinking about this is,
I think
Go ahead.
sorry, let me clarify. So you wanna, I don't quite understand, because you wanna track the actual bytes that are moved, right? But I think the dedupe happened after the bytes are moved. It happened on the repository side.
Okay.
That's something I don't know the answer there.
Yeah.
So a little bit of more what we're trying to get at, and this is it's a combination of trying to dealing with customers with very large data sets, and the first backup obviously takes longer, the second one's going to be shorter because of the dedupe and the incremental aspect. And one thing we're trying to get is better metrics around how long things are taking and storage and all. And so if we had some way of indicating in the data upload status, whether it was a question of transfer, or whether there's a question of how much, basically some way of for customers of seeing, okay, this is a an incremental backup, and so even though the volume might have been 2 terabytes, it's actually a smaller transfer, a smaller size, a smaller something the second time around to give them some kind of notion of improved performance, based on that. I
I've
just don't know what
pasted
the
a
right
link
metrics
here
are
how
going to be.
this Copia CLI is trying to guess or calculate those numbers, but it's not straight available like from the APIs.
I mean, the
It's
numbers
only
we have
CLI.
now about bytes done, that's separate. We're not changing that. That's useful because that tells you, okay, this is the size of the volume, the actual volume size we're copying. How much of that is done, meaning how much of it is we've already scanned, we've already looked at, we've already uploaded, whatever. That's useful information in its own right. We're trying to come up with some additional field that might provide some insight into the whole incremental nature of subsequent backups.
Yeah. Sorry, I was a little distracted just now when you were speaking. I think as a follow-up, could you add a comment? So actually you wanna somehow take into account about the deduped byte of the so only track incrementals like data, right?
Right. On in the incremental backup, the date and the time that it takes for the data upload to complete and the amount of data that's actually being sent is much lower.
But the time we already have,
we're
that
doing
information-
ourselves a disservice to Velero users by not clearly showing that it's faster the second time and it's less data the second time, and we're totally not doing that.
Yeah, okay, I understand. So would you mind adding another comment, because I see Yonghui is following up the issue, and tomorrow we have a meeting and we can discuss that in more depth.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, that's a valid concern.
And it sounds like we have all we need on the time side. That's just a calculated field that doesn't have to modify anything. It's just we need some additional data on the incremental backups, to some way of showing, okay, this is less data either transferred or stored or whatever metric we have available to. And part of this too is it's going to help from a debug point of view, because users are saying, hey, this backup's supposed to be incremental. It took just as long. How do I know it was incremental? If we have some field showing the deduping, we can say, look, we know it's incremental because your first backup stored 2 terabytes, your second backup only, modified, stored whatever, 100 gigabytes or something. And so we'd have that information at the ready. And right now, all we can say is, well, it's Copia says it's incremental, so it must be.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay. Anshul. Oh, yeah, that's right.
So
Go ahead.
this issue me and Scott have been discussing around the deprecation process. I mean, I'll let other folks kind of review it offline, and then we can have a discussion in the next community meeting. Both of us have put a bunch of thoughts, and it is stemming from this particular issue. But yeah, I mean, just have a look, folks. I think post that we can decide how do we want to progress. And one quick question, Scott. So
Yes.
what version of Velero are you folks on in downstream?
Okay, so for OADP, our latest release is 1.4, and that's based on 1.14. We'll be going to 1.14.1 in our next patch release. So we also have OADP 1.3, which is our previous release. We actually skipped 1.13, so that one's based off 1.12. So we're using 1.12 and 1.14 currently.
Okay. So I mean, I just asked that question because the deprecation we were discussing, right? If your customers are on 12 and whenever you go to 15, if they do that 2 jumps, they will kind of hit the same issue.
Right, exactly.
I mean,
in fact, I was noting internally that this actually affects OADP even more, because sometimes we'll skip a Velero release just because our release process is a little bit longer. So when you say something's going to be gone in 2 releases, that means for OADP, that means it might have been deprecated in 1.4 and gone in 1.5, or whatever.
we also mostly go.
Yeah, and I think in terms of features going away in general, I think 2 releases again is probably fine. I think we need to have maybe reconsider the question of backups. Is that how long? if I do a backup with a certain release, release N, how long will that backup be good to restore? And my concern there is maybe we want to increase that beyond 2, maybe just 3. I don't know. I mean, I don't think we need a huge change. We may not need a change at all, but I think we need to be careful about thinking, because it's not just about it. Okay, I have this feature. I have a few months to figure out how to stop using it. I have a backup from 6 months ago that I need to restore, but I've upgraded 2 versions since then, and now I can't. That, again, we can document that may be fine, but I guess what we need to think about is, in real world scenarios, how long from a calendar point of view do customers want to keep a backup useful? If someone says, I need a backup from a year ago still to work, that's a very different thing than, because that would require more than 2 releases. That would require at least 3 releases. I just don't know, again.
So,
Yep.
yeah, just on that note, and I'm not speaking from authority here, but I know like some of the projects that build on top of Velero have a like a backup that is restored. I think I heard 2 years prior needs, excuse me, a backup taken 2 years ago needs to be able to be restored. I think I don't know if there's anyone on the call that can speak to, I think there's regulations around this for probably some of the people that use Velero. And that is something that we should maybe ask publicly in the various community channels. We should find this out.
Just speaking about Velero specifically, and looking at our last few releases, if you look at 112 and 114's release dates, if we're saying, for example, that deprecation of something in 112 makes, and then we removed it in 114 completely, if that meant that, for example, a backup,
I would take issue
111
with anything deprecated in V112 because there was no deprecation policy.
I'm using it as an example because we have data.
Okay.
Assume the deprecation policy has been here forever, because we're talking about whether the deprecation policy is sufficient. So I'm speaking kind of for the future, but I'm using 112 and 114 as examples because we have actual release dates. Those 2 releases are about 9 months apart.
Yeah.
Meaning that if I took a backup the day before we upgraded to 112 on 111, and then we upgraded to 114, that's 9 months and 1 day apart, but 3 releases span that, because it's the last backup before the 112 upgrade. By our current deprecation policy, that backup might not be allowed to be, might not be restorable on 114, which means here's a backup that's 9 months and 1 day old, it's useless. That might not be acceptable.
Yeah.
It's useless if you upgrade to 114, but you can use like 1.14.
Right, exactly. No, that's right. It's just that the other problem is, see, if this wasn't a Kubernetes application, you could say, oh, I just need to use the old version to restore this. Problem is that you can't install 114 and 112 at the same cluster at the same time because of the CRDs. That's the problem. You have to downgrade your entire cluster version of Velero to an older version to restore that old backup. And maybe that's acceptable, but we have to document that as here's look, if you're using an old backup, you really do have to downgrade your cluster. I mean, that's not necessarily something we want to tell people to do, but we have to tell them that if that's our policy. And it may be you kind of pick something in between. You say, well, okay, we want to keep deprecated features specific to features that affect restore. I mean, again, if it's a feature that doesn't affect restore, the regular policy is fine. The question is features that will make old backups useless, that kind of deprecation. One possibility is to kind of split the difference. Say, okay, if it's within a year, we're good. So therefore, we commit to not not removing features that are deprecated for at least a year if they affect restore. And then if you're in a 2-year restore policy, then you do have to install an old version. The other problem with telling customers to install an old version is that means we have to support that old version longer. So if for example, you say we're going to keep a deprecated feature around for a year, but we'll allow you to restore it as something that's 2 years old if you downgrade, that means you have to support that 1-year-old Velero. So that's the downside of the downgrade, in addition to the inconvenience of telling someone with a large cluster they have to download if you have to downgrade Velero to restore this thing, that means you have to put your backup policy on hold while you're downgrading and restoring. That's another problem. Again, because the cluster doesn't allow multiple versions to be installed at the same time.
Hi, Scott. May I have a quick question?
Yes.
So basically, this is Yunqian from Delta. We are trying to upgrade Velero to 1.14. But when I using 1.14, I saw when Velero, the backup works, but when I try to restore, the Velero after finish restore those metadata, it's stuck on one status called arrowing, updating, finalizing field. I don't know. Do you have any idea on it? And then I checked the document on 1.14. It shows up that the finalizing is a new field added to the restore API on 1.14.
So you're saying that it's trying to update it to finalizing, but the error is saying that.
But did you upgrade the CRD? How
Yeah,
did
I was
you
gonna say that
upgrade?
sounds like you have the old CRDs.
Yeah.
The CRDs didn't get upgraded.
Yep.
So in what you mean is if only the CRD update, the restore should works?
Probably. I mean, that's an error that I would see if you upgraded Velero, but the CRDs didn't get upgraded. So if the CRDs that are in the cluster don't match the Velero that's running, you're going to have all sorts of problems with invalid fields because those may not match.
So
basically,
So the API they are using for the restore, should I also need to update it or not? The restore YAML, the API.
No, that I don't believe anything the restored YAML changed. These are fields for the status, which Velero manages. The user doesn't manage.
Okay.
I would suggest. I would suggest after you upgrade, you always check the CRD to make necessary change to your YAML file if you're using an old YAML file to do the restore. Because when we say API change, there may be new fields introduced. We will, try our best not to break anything, but it's always good to double check, I think.
On the spec side, generally those new fields are all optional, so the old YAML should still work. Again, like I said, it's always good to check, double check the documents, but a breaking change where an old YAML no longer works would be a big thing that we need to call out.
Normally not. Yeah.
You might be right, because I check sometimes the restore works, sometimes it not works. Maybe the time works is because I clean up the CRD. The time not works is because the old CRD still left behind.
Yeah. Anytime the CRDs don't match, things are going to break. And what breaks is going to be different with every release. So that's always kind of a tricky one to debug. That kind of gets at what I was saying before about that's why it's a hard thing to tell users you need to downgrade to restore this old deprecated feature, because the CRDs, you have to actually downgrade the entire cluster as Velero. You can't just install another one for just the restore, because you can't.
So basically, that finalizing is a new field you added to the restore to the status field of the restore API.
It's not a new field. It's a new phase, because the way the workflow goes through, it's new, it's in progress. And it's completed or it's failed. So finalizing is a new phase that we go through, a new controller that does some cleanup for the restore relating to hooks, and I'm not sure what else is there, but there are a couple of things that we do. I think relating to volumes as well. So it's a new phase in restore that has some restore workflow cleanup steps at the end.
Basically, we are trying to patch the restore, and we have some set of phases that we know of, and those got upgraded, and your CRD does not have that. That's why it's failing.
Okay, got it. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yep, sure.
Yeah, just to add one scenario, right? So we also hit this, I think, in 1.11 when new phases were added. And the gap that we realized was in the Helm chart, the upgrade CRD's job that we have. In our downstream, it was a post hook. So basically pods come up, and I think after that we were upgrading the CRDs, whereas it should be vice versa. You upgrade the CRDs first and then you kind of install. Basically, in the Helm chart, if you see, there are the upgrade CRD's job has a certain annotation which says this is a pre-hook or a post-hook.
Yep.
So maybe double check in your downstream if it is a pre-hook or a post-hook, because in post-hook, if things don't go right, that is when you're likely to end up in this situation. And we kind of hit this exact same issue in downstream long back. So yeah, just double check that it's fixed in upstream right now. But yeah, in downstream, maybe we check because older Helm charts had this problem. So yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay. Were there any other topics that people want to discuss?
So what's the follow up about this, M+2 support? Because that, yeah.
It sounds like there's a couple of follow-ups. One is read through that issue in the discussions. I think my last comment was my attempt to summarize where we were in general. I mean, the issue is a specific concern about, hey, for this particular feature, when to deprecate it. And I think the answer there may be, for now, let's just not remove it in 1.15. Let's wait on that, because again, deprecation policy is a minimum. It says, it must be around for 2 more releases. It doesn't mean we have, sometimes people decide to delay removing a deprecated feature for various reasons. Users are still needing it or whatever. So we can delay that for now while we're discussing this. I think that's fine. So I think maybe the immediate thing to me is we should probably pull that out of 1.15, saying, no, we're not going to remove this yet. And the longer term is to say, do we need to revisit the deprecation policy specifically around restoring old backups? Does that need an exception to last longer than 2 releases? And that goes back to, what are people's retention policies? What do we expect the workflow to be? Do we really expect them to downgrade? Do we want to have some, time? And in other words, we could say 2 releases or some time, whichever is greater. That would allow us to say, for example, hey, restorability needs to be there for old backups, regardless of feature deprecation, for at least 1 year, as an example. Again, that's not a policy. That's just a thought. Maybe it's 2 years will be a lot more work. We need to kind of think through this. What makes sense there? I think 2 things on the deprecation policy. We may want to, again, we probably want to make an exception for things that involve restorability. We already kind of hinted that there right now, but it's not quite clear. But also on the restore side, we may want to include a time consideration as well as a number of releases situation, because release cadence is pretty consistent, but not guaranteed. So, if there's some customer requirement to have backups around for a certain time, I don't think you can translate that to strictly release cadence, because we might, release things sooner or later. So I think if there's a minimum time here, we may want to call that out on the policy as well.
Okay.
What that time should be, again, we need to discuss. Sounds like, Wes said, hey, it might need to be as long as 2 years. I don't know, 1 year, I think, in my mind, 1 year is kind of a minimum, I think. So maybe, but again, we can discuss that. If anyone knows what other backup products have around this as a policy, that might be helpful too. Or if we could research that a little bit, just to see what, Velero competitors are doing here. If others are saying, hey, we can restore your backups for 2 years, and we're saying 2 releases, that's a mismatch. Expectations. But I have no idea again what other products are doing there and what they're promising.
Yeah. I'll check with Jolene.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, AKS is still new, like Kubernetes is still new for us, but in the VM backup product that we have in our team, right, we actually support up to 10 years of retention. There are certain customers who need the data for audit purposes, I think banks and healthcare, and they do have 10-year retention for certain customers. And even for our product, we have a solution where we kind of copy the data to a low-cost media. So consider an S3 cold tier storage, and there, like 1 year, 2 years is like a very standard duration is what you could expect, because it's cheaper and customers don't really care. 10 years is something which we are after. I mean, we want to eventually get there, and this actually concerns us on how do we achieve that. I mean, I understand Kubernetes is very different from the standard VM world. It's like not that trivial, and we might not be able to get there, but yeah, 2 years might be a good starting point to get there eventually, right? So
and it might also be worth considering, again, possibly, there's the easy, in other words, maybe it's 1 or 2 years where it's saying, hey, we don't remove it for this period of time, and so a customer can easily restore any backup within that period with the latest Velero. That's one thing. We might have a longer policy that says, beyond that, we do support it, but you have to downgrade. And in other words, for really old backups, I think it's acceptable to say you can still do this, but it's a more cumbersome process because it'll
But
be very rare.
I wonder if it's taking the extreme example of something like 10 years. I suspect it's certain files and data that need to be protected for 10 years and not the ability to restore the application in Kubernetes or a VM in Kubernetes and put it just like it was 10 years ago. I suspect it's just files, and I wonder if that's a good reason to rethink being able to back up certain files off a PV versus the entire app as well.
I mean, the data only backup and restore, I think is that is a feature on the roadmap. And
Yeah.
to your point, it might be too. Again, I think this question of restorability and retention policy, it doesn't have to be one size fits all. You know, as I said, it's pretty clear we're not going to say, hey, you can just restore a 10-year-old backup, you know, in Velero with the latest version. I mean, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
You know, there might be some tiered approach here saying, okay, you know, within a year, within 2 years, whatever that is, that's fully functional, restore anything. Beyond that, we have a more specific policy that might require downgrading Velero, or it might say, once we have this data only backup and restore feature, okay, your Copia backups, your data mover backups, you know, those will be longer, and we'll have some process by which we can adopt an old Copia. I don't know, you know, again, that's a longer term. That's not a deprecation policy so much as a feature. That's a new feature. Do we support, you know, a data only backup or restore from an old backup via some means that's, you know, limited? Is, you know, you're not. I don't know what that would look like. That may be the only way you can get something much longer than a couple of years. That's out of scope of this. But
I
yeah.
think the entire discussion is around being able to restore from backup versus archive. So we are talking here about long-term archive, which isn't really the backup. Backup is something that should be available for restore straight away. And if we're talking about 2, 3, 4, 5 years, this is like archive of
Yeah, I think
what
those are
is in the
I
S3,
think you're right.
right?
There's two discussions.
Yeah.
I do think the initial discussion here about deprecation features, saying just any old backup, you know, I think we do need to have that discussion first as to, I don't know that 2 releases is sufficient for saying, hey, you know, this backup from 9 months ago should still be restorable fully. You know, maybe that only goes to a year. I don't know, instead of 2 releases. But I think that's a discussion we can have initially to say, you know, do we have some slightly extended time frame beyond 2 releases? Because all that possibly means is deprecation features that affect restore, you know, need to be around for 3 releases versus 2 versus 4. I don't know. I'm saying that's a more limited discussion versus these longer term archiving questions. I think that's a completely different discussion that's worth having, but I think it's separate from the deprecation feature.
One more question. So, do we know if there's a deprecation policy for Copia? Like, do they ensure compatibility till X version? Because, I mean, that could also potentially break, is what I started wondering after what you just said.
Oh, in other words, if I do a backup with Velero 1.14 with whatever version of Copia we have now, then Velero 1.16 uses a new version of Copia. Is that newer version of Copia can be compatible with those older version of Copia backups in our repository?
Yeah, and do we have any tests to ensure that does not break is also what I was wondering.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I haven't on the Velero side, I don't know that we upstream have any tests about this.
I haven't
pasted
checked
a link here.
Red Hat has some tests we're doing with older backups and restoring within a certain range. Wes, do you remember how far back we like what kind of version SKU we're testing with that? Obviously, Copia.
There's a link to Copia compatibility in the chat.
With regards to our testing,
I mean,
it's supposed to go back more than one Y version on our downstream. I have not seen those recently, and we should probably.
So you know, I guess we're kind of working towards that. I guess is a better way of saying that.
Yeah.
With Copia in particular, obviously we don't go back multiple releases because that's still a relatively new feature. But that is a valid question, and I think we do need to deal with that. Is that, you know, we talk about you know, within Velero, we're not doing anything to break old backups, and we're talking about here about making sure we don't do it for a certain number of releases or a certain amount of time. But for anything we rely on outside of Velero, such as Copia, that's part of this. It needs to be. If we say that a backup needs to be restorable for a year, that means whatever Copia upgrades happen during that year, the newest version of Copia needs to be able to cope with the Copia from a year ago backup. We need to be testing that, and if it's not working, we need to figure out how to resolve that.
But
Because
it's up
Michael,
to... Yes, please go.
I was just highlighting, Michael, go ahead, please. I was just highlighting.
Yeah, so it's up to Velero to decide which version of Copia is being used, and the
exactly.
compatibility is there clearly stated. It's around versioning, not the
Right.
nothing else.
And so Velero, a Velero version includes a Copia version, and so it's up to Velero to make sure that when we upgrade Copia, because we need a new feature, because we're fixing a bug, that new version of Copia is still able to restore those backups from the previous version of Copia within whatever window we're saying are compatible. So yeah, no, it is up to Velero to choose the Copia versions to make sure that the things are backwards compatible. But it's something we need to be aware of when we upgrade Copia. We need to have testing around that to make sure that, you know, backups from the previous version of Copia are restorable with the new version of Copia through whatever version Delta we're dealing with.
So basically, as per the docs, it says up to N-1 is what they will support. So in Velero also, we can't really stay stuck on one version, because at any time in the future when we upgrade, basically if N+2 is our deprecation policy, we can only bump Copia by 1 versions when we bump Velero by 2 versions.
Right. I see what you're saying. Yeah. In other words, so then that actually matters for this policy. So we're saying, although well, this actually is not part of our deprecation policy. It's more of our release upgrade. But the point is, yeah, if we have with the current policy, we need to be able to restore a backup from 2 releases ago. So if Copia's policy is N-1, then we have a problem if we're bumping Copia every release. No, in practice, we don't bump Copia that often, but it's not something we necessarily think about all the time.
Yeah.
And we need some document that maybe shows Copia version to Velero version matches. The other problem is that means you can't bump. In other words, say you stayed on the same Copia version because you wanted to maintain compatibility, within the N-1, but now it's been a year since we've upgraded Copia, and we need a new feature, and Copia is 3 versions ahead. Now what do you do?
That's a big issue.
In other words, if Copia's release cadence is consistently faster than Velero's, or even equal to Velero's because of N-1 versus N-2, you're going to get a point where you can't be within the N-1 for the year. And what is the answer there? Is there some way in Copia to convert an old repo to a new one? I don't know. Copia says I can't, copy this data from N-2, but is there a way to take an existing Copia repo and migrate it to the new version of Copia if there's a format change? Again, I don't know, but those are things separate from
I think that's
policy, we need to investigate.
There is migrate.
There is,
migrate operation, but it's around different. I tested this with different hashing algorithms. I don't know around changes in the APIs or the data store of Copia. So
at least in the link that you shared, Mihal, it's saying that it will offer migration mechanism for old readable repository format to current one.
Okay, so this is manual step like Copia.
Without it can't happen without human interaction. Without
but when Copia is upgraded, does the new Copia still work with the repository that includes backups from the old Copia?
It will at least be able to read the snapshots from one previous version.
But so what happens if, okay, so I'm using version 1, Velero version 1, Copia version 1. Let's just keep it simple. Do a backup. I have a daily backup process. Everything's incremental. I upgrade Velero to version 2, Copia version 2. That's fine. Those incremental backups have old snapshots with the Copia version 1, new snapshots with Copia version 2. What happens if I upgrade Velero again?
So in this compatibility doc, it's written that it may allow you to read from that repo, but it won't allow you to write to that repo, meaning that you won't be able to create incremental backups, but you may be able to restore from the backup itself.
Okay. Yeah, that's something that could affect Velero as is today. Then
So in the third upgrade version of Velero, if we do a new backup, if we create the same backup, will it be a new backup in the repository, or will it refer the parent snapshots?
or will the repository be considered read-only because it's
Yeah.
an old two
Okay.
versions old?
Okay.
Again, we haven't been on Copia long enough to hit this issue, but it sounds like, again, unrelated to deprecation policy, this is an issue for customers that do incremental backups of stable, long-standing applications over multiple Velero versions.
And it
This
should be
could be
part, I think, of some Velero operation to check whether the repo being used currently is not old enough to be consumed going forward. So, in other words, prior to create an incremental backup, there should be a check whether the repo is not older than one version.
yeah.
Right?
But if it is, what do we do? Because you don't want to invalidate the old backups. But right now, I don't believe Velero is set up to have multiple Copia repositories in one PSL.
Exactly. So that's a problem here.
I-
So either migrate to a new version, I don't know, do some create some automation around upgrading. So Velero will handle upgradation between different Copia repos.
it sounds like what we need to do here is we need to create a GitHub issue to investigate Copia upgrade migration support issues around this. Mikhail, do you want to create that since you had some thoughts on it already? Just one of these going to investigate issues, kind of a long-term issue. If not,
Yes.
someone else could.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you can create that issue, that'd be great. If you want to work on it, that's great. If not, just let us know and we can get someone else to look at it. But I think this is something we do need to address. It does sound like this could be a problem once we get to a point where Velero has used multiple Copia versions.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other discussion topics, or we done what we need for here now? There's no other topics. I think we can end here. On my side, I will get back to my getting my PR rebased and testing it, and we will continue the rest of this on Slack and online. Have a great week, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.